Today we're going to learn about three new kinds of clauses that take the subjunctive, and for the first time we're moving into clauses that can take all different tenses of the subjunctive. So we'll finally get to use the perfect and the pluperfect. So let's take a look at these. These new clauses, which are indirect questions, clauses of doubting, and clauses of fearing, use all four tenses of the subjunctive. So when our main verb is in primary sequence, if you remember, that is, if it is in the present, future, future perfect, or the perfect where we're translating it with the word have, then in the dependent clause, you can have either the present subjunctive, or if we're talking about something that happened prior to the action of the main verb, the perfect subjunctive. And since we haven't been looking at the perfect subjunctive lately, I just wanted to remind you of what it looks like. And I'm using here the verb duco just as an example, but you can see that the perfect active looks a lot like the future perfect, almost completely. And the perfect passive has that fourth principal part plus the present subjunctive of the verb to be. Ductus sum, ductus sis, ductus sit, etc. Okay? If we are in secondary sequence instead, that is, if our main verb is in the imperfect, the pluperfect, or the perfect where we translate it as just a simple past, then we use the imperfect subjunctive to show sort of simultaneous action or action that will happen afterwards, and we use the pluperfect to show past action. And again, just to remind ourselves of what this looks like, the pluperfect active is that perfect infinitive with endings on it, so duxissem, duxisses, duxisset, etc. And the pluperfect passive is that fourth principal part plus the imperfect of the verb to be. Ductus essem, ductus esses, ductus esset, etc. Okay? So just to remind you, those are the forms we're going to be working with. Our first kind is indirect questions. And these are really, really obvious when we look at them because they always have a question word in them. So they're like indirect statements in that they follow some kind of verb that is usually some kind of head verb, right? But instead of saying, I know that you are tall, right? You might say, I think, or I know what you are thinking, right? So that what in a sentence like that indicates that we have an indirect question, not an indirect statement. So these are questions that we're making indirect. But we don't use an accusative infinitive in these situations because, of course, if it's a question, again, like the implication is that you're uncertain of what the answer is. And so that lack of certainty for Latin means that we want to use a subjunctive to make it clear that we may think something, but we're not sure really, okay? Because it's really a question. Again, you're not going to find these after every head verb, but verbs of asking and verbs of some kind of perception, especially knowing, are verbs that often will take an indirect question. And you'll see this I think will be sort of clear to you momentarily. And of course, we need some kind of question word in directly following our verb to make it clear that it's a question. And so words that you know that introduce questions like cur, which means why, or quomodo, which means how, quis, who, quid, what, num, whether, ubi, when or where, depending. I guess here in this situation it's probably where. But these kinds of words indicate that we have some kind of question, and these kinds of questions are followed by the subjunctive. Negative is non or some other word that makes something negative, like numquam, never, nemo, no one, nullus, no, right? Any of those would make a sentence negative too, a clause negative. And most important, these are not translated in a subjunctive way. In the same way that result clauses really usually aren't translated in a subjunctive way, right? It's just the result. Indirect questions, too, are not translated as a subjunctive because, of course, a direct question wouldn't be in the subjunctive either. The subjunctive is really just showing that whoever is doing the thinking or the asking in the main part of the sentence isn't sure of the answer of the question. So let me give you some examples. So here I have this model sentence, right, where we might say something like, Ubi est Marcus? Where is Marcus? And so I can make this an indirect question in a lot of different ways. And so here I'm using primary sequence, and below I'm going to use secondary, okay? So te rogo, I'm asking you, ubi Marcus sit, where Marcus is. So you can see I've transformed this original question, ubi est Marcus, into this, ubi Marcus sit. So it's the same words except that now it's in the subjunctive after this verb of asking. And you can see that I'm asking because where Marcus is, where he may be, because I'm not sure where he is, right? So it's that uncertainty of the speaker that puts it into the subjunctive, but we translate it like it's an indicative in English. And I could talk about Marcus in the past, right? Te rogo ubi Marcus fuerit. I'm asking you where Marcus was yesterday. So you can see these kinds of clauses can, unlike purpose clauses or result clauses where the action's always going to come in the future, these are things that can logically, right, you can ask about something that happened the day before, just as you can with, say, indirect statement. And so here we're going to have to use the whole range of the subjunctive verbs available to us. Likewise, if we're in secondary sequence, I could say, te rogavi ubi Marcus esset. I asked you yesterday where Marcus was yesterday, right? So this is showing that this thing is happening at the same time as this, right? Where was he yesterday? I asked you. Whereas, te rogavi ubi Marcus fuisset, I asked you where Marcus had been. It's clear that this happened before I asked you about it, right? Where had he been the day before? Now, sometimes with indirect questions, we can sort of fall out of sequence of tenses. This doesn't happen very often, but it is possible, and your book brings it up, so I bring it up. I could conceivably have something like te rogo ubi Marcus fusit. I'm asking you where Marcus had been. So in that sense, this is something similar to what you could do with the indicative, right? I could ask you about something not just that was in the past, but was even further in the past relative to something else maybe I'm talking about. So this kind of shifting of the subjunctive can happen, and so you may see it in your textbook, but it is really not very common at all. It's best probably just to remember that it follows sequence of tenses, and certainly I will never give you anything that violates the rule of sequence of tenses. Okay? One sort of special thing about indirect questions are these questions that are whether words. And this is something that you dealt with when you looked at direct questions when you were learning these many chapters ago. And if you recall, you had words like on, which means whether, and these can also indicate, right, often it's, you have two options, whether this or that. And so you can do, these are also indirect questions. They look slightly different than other kinds of indirect questions. Many of them are introduced with this word num. And so if it's introduced with num, it's pretty clear. So I could say, Nescio num Marcus adsit. I don't know whether Marcus is here, whether Marcus is present. Maybe he's present, maybe he isn't. I don't know. Num Marcus adsit. We can also introduce it with an or utrum, or that nay that we put onto a question just to indicate that it's a yes-no question. And those yes-no questions, right, in a regular direct question, we would have anon or not. Here we have this word nekne. And so I'm going to show you a couple of examples of other ways we can do whether questions. So if I asked a direct question, Marcus ne bonus est an malus. Is Marcus good or bad? Bonus an malus. Whether he is good or bad. Which is it? If we make this an indirect question, you can see that a couple of things happen. Obviously, our verb becomes subjunctive since it moves into the indirect question. And we're going to have several possibilities. One is that we have it in the subjunctive and we have on, and we have no word here, right? No word that indicates whether. It's that on in it plus the subjunctive that indicates it. And so you just have to say, you have to sort of introduce whether after the nescio. I don't know whether Marcus is good or bad. Nescio Marcus bonus sit an malus. This is the trickiest kind because you want some kind of word in there to show you, like num, right? That you have an indirect question. You don't always get it. So that's the trickiest kind. But sometimes you do get something like utrum in here to indicate that you have one of these whether clauses. Nescio utrum Marcus bonus sit an malus. I don't know whether Marcus is good or bad. You can see the translation's no different. It's just that sometimes you have the utrum and sometimes you don't. And then finally, you can also have this kind where you have the ne, and then maybe you would have nekne here, right? So nescio Marcus ne bonus sit nekne. I don't know whether Marcus is good, nekne, or not. Okay? So these are different options that you have for these kinds of questions. In all honesty, the whether kinds of questions are not super common. Of course, we do need to be able to recognize them and translate them accurately. And we'll practice with these, of course. I think the kinds that are introduced by cur or ubi or quis or quid are more obvious. These are a little trickier. Our next kind of clause is what's called a clause of doubting. This in some ways is really just a variety of an indirect question, and we'll see what I mean by that, I think, in a moment. But they are super, super obvious because you have to have a verb that means to doubt. And really the only two phrases that you typically see are this verb dubito, which means I doubt, or this phrase dubitum est, it is doubtful. So I doubt, or it is doubtful that, whether, and then you get your clause with the subjunctive following sequence of tenses. Positive clauses of doubting are introduced by either on or num. So you can see this is why I say it's really a variety of an indirect question, because it's like these whether questions. Negative ones or questions that involve dubito are followed by quin, not unlike prohibitions. And so let's take a look at this. So you can see in positive, this is in primary sequence. Dubito an Marcus adsit. I doubt that Marcus is here, or I doubt whether Marcus is here. You can translate that either way. You can also see that with this dubito here, there's no mistaking what kind of clause this is. It's a clause of doubting. I doubt. We can also use, using sequence of tenses, we could talk about something you doubt now about something that happened in the past, right? Dubito num Marcus domum redierit. I doubt that Marcus has gone home, right? So this is really talking about, I doubt now that Marcus went home earlier, right? So here we use the perfect subjunctive in primary sequence to talk about a past action. But we're still doubting, we're using either on or num. It's pretty straightforward. Now, if we have a negative, things are slightly different. And these two, this one I put in secondary sequence just so you can see what that would look like. Non dubitum erat, quin Marcus domi esset. There was no doubt that Marcus was at home. So there was no doubt yesterday, in the past, that Marcus yesterday was at home. None. Here you can see you use quin, right, because it's a negative statement. Here's our negative, right? So it's not that it's negative in the clause, it's that the main clause is negative. Okay, that means that you're going to use quin here. There was no doubt that Marcus was at home. Quin Marcus domi esset. And here we're back to primary, but I wanted to show you an example of a question and how the question also uses quin, right? Quis dubitat quin Marcus domi manere velit? Who doubts that Marcus wants to stay at home? Oh, that should say stay. Okay. Who doubts that Marcus wants to stay at home? Not me, right? So quin indicates that that we have a question, not that it's negative. Again, we're in primary sequence, and so our verb is in the present subjunctive, velit, but we're not going to translate it in a subjunctive way, right? All of these are translated as though they're in the indicative. The subjunctive idea really is that verb of doubting. I doubt, right? Which indicates that things are unsure, and so you can see why you would have a verb in the subjunctive. One final note that's sort of special about this verb dubito. While dubito often means to doubt, it can also mean to hesitate. And when it means hesitate, it is not followed by a clause of doubting because we're not doubting anything now, we're just hesitating. And in those situations, it takes an infinitive. So you can see, here's my example, Marcus ad urbem venire dubitat. Marcus hesitates to come to the city. So you do have to remember this rule, but it's also really handy because if you see dubito plus an infinitive, you know that it means hesitate and not doubt, and so it's a good little tip to know. Finally, we have clauses of fearing. Now, in English, sometimes we say we fear to do something, where fearing is followed by an infinitive. And Latin can do that too if all you're doing is that you're afraid to jump or you're afraid to hike or whatever you might be afraid of doing. And here you can see I've given you an example, timeo natare, I am afraid to swim. Right? So timeo plus an infinitive, it's just a very brief statement where it's taking a complementary infinitive, right? The thing that you're afraid of. I'm afraid of swimming, you could easily say, right? It's that same idea. But if you're going to say, I'm afraid that we may go to war or something like that, where you have a long clause that expresses what it is that your fear is, then you have to use a clause of fearing just as you would have to use a clause in English. These clauses of fearing, just like the other clauses we've been looking at, follow sequence of tenses, primary and secondary, and there's this special wrinkle. These clauses use ut and ne, as we've seen a lot of clauses, but it's switched. We use ne for positive fears, things that we're afraid may happen, and we use ut for negative fears, things that we're afraid won't happen. This is weird, I grant you. It's the only clause that works this way, so it's actually pretty easy to remember. It usually sticks in your head. So let's take a look at a couple of. So here again, I have some sentences for you in primary sequence, and these I'll start with timeo, and you can see that the first one I have given you is positive, and the second one I have given you is negative. Okay, so timeo ne Marcus hoc faciat. I am afraid that, right? So there's my ne, that Marcus is doing this. Timeo ne Marcus hoc faciat. In the negative, timeo ut Marcus hoc feceret. So here you can see I'm using this perfect subjunctive to show action that happened prior. I am afraid that Marcus has not done this. Right? So ut, that Marcus has not done this. Ut Marcus hoc feceret. So there's no word that means no. You can see that. You just know because it's a fear clause and you have ut that we're going to make it negative. Okay? So likewise, you can see here I have some in secondary sequence. Timebam ne Marcus hoc faceret. Right? So again, this is positive because it's ne. I am afraid that Marcus was doing this. Positive statement. Or I could say negative, and here we have the pluperfect subjunctive, right, to show that this has happened prior to timebam. I was afraid that Marcus had not done this. So two things to remember here, right? Follows sequence of tenses. We can use all four tenses of the subjunctive and fear clauses, and ne is for positive, ut is for negative. If you're interested in why this is the case, there's a really nice explanation in your textbook. You can read it. So finally, to sum up, we have three new clauses, if we want to think of them that way. We have indirect questions, which are introduced by verbs of asking or perception, like knowing, and then you have a question word. Usually these question words are words that are like cur, ubi, quisquid, quomodo, something like that. But we can also have those weather kinds, and those are slightly trickier. They have num or an, utrum an, and sometimes we just have the ne and then the neck ne. These are all words that we should just be on the lookout for, especially if you see a verb of asking or knowing followed by a verb in the subjunctive. It's a good thing to anticipate that you're going to see. Our next kind of clause are clauses of doubting, and these are super obvious because you have to have a form of dubito or dubitum est. They are introduced by an or num, and in the negative we have quin. Quin also appears if we have questions. Do you doubt that? That would be quin. Okay? And then finally, we have fear clauses. Fear clauses also are pretty obvious because you have to have a verb of fearing, and then you're going to have ne for positive fears, things that you're afraid of, and ut for things that you're afraid won't happen. So send me your 3 questions, up to 3 questions, and we will go over your questions in class and begin to practice with these new kinds of clauses.